Welcome to week 2 of Linda Dillow's book study, Creative Counterpart. This week we were studying Chapter 3 on God's game plan. Chapter 3 is about God's game plan for us to be a creative counterpart to our husbands. Linda Dillow starts out the chapter with 2 examples of different women and their approaches to being creative counterparts to their husband. We meet Susan, who was a doer, a planner, and a controller. And she was trapped in a vicious circle of trying hard, failing, and then having feelings of guilt. Susan's focus was on the individual's part, not necessarily on God's part. She thinks people are responsible for their own spiritual success. She sets up a program, she tries to follow it, but because she is in this vicious circle, when she fails, she has these horrible feelings of guilt. Then we meet Mary. She's a prime example of letting go and letting God. She talks spiritually, she sounds good, but on the inside, she is simply miserable because she doesn't see God working through her life like she says he's supposed to be. While she is sitting and waiting for God to work through her life, she is becoming frustrated and guilt-ridden, just like the other woman, Susan. In the meantime, she started spending large quantities of time looking for the secret to that spirit-filled life. Which of those 2 women can you most likely relate to? I personally feel like I am more like Susan. I'm a doer and one who needs to control my circumstances, and I plan and I try my hardest to do everything right. And just like Linda wrote here, when I fail, I have so much guilt over my failure. On page 25, Linda speaks about the balance. It can't be 50% God and 50% man. It has to be 100% God and 100% man. And the first thing we need to do is obey. Obey what God has commanded us to do, and then God will start working through us. I think the best part of this chapter was on page 26 when Linda Dillow wrote, God receives us not on the basis of how well we live up to the beautiful blueprint in Proverbs 31, but completely on the merits of his Son. And that's comforting to me, that to know that no matter how much I fail, which some days it seems huge, that God is still going to be there for me. He's still going to accept me as a sinner for who I am. Failures, successes, the whole works. God does not accept me on the basis of how well I succeed in doing what he wants me to do. On page 28, Linda writes how easy it is for our focus to be on all of our failures and forget how faithful God has been to us in the past. And she brings out in this chapter about the Israelites and how God helped them escape Egypt. Then he performed the miracle of dividing the Red Sea and them being able to cross over, all while they are being pursued by Pharaoh and his army, and that huge miracle and God delivering from that. And then just a few days later, they have forgotten everything that God had done for them and began to complain. And how prone we are to do that same thing, to forget what God has done for us. Often we only see our present circumstances and we forget to look back and see what God has done in our life. Someone once told me that they struggled with worry. And one of the ways they combated that worry and turned their worry over to God was by having a worry jar. And they had this little jar that they put on a shelf, and it had a little pad of paper there. And whenever this lady began to worry, she would go to her jar, she would write down what she was worried about, she would pray over it, and then she would take that piece of paper and stick it inside of her jar. And she would stop worrying because she had taken her worry, written it down, and she had given it to God. And I really thought that was a very creative idea for doing something very tangible, very physical, and being able to deal with that concern. Because oftentimes, if you're like me, first something comes into your mind, and then before you know it, it starts making you a little bit anxious, and you find you're thinking about it a lot, and before you know it, it consumes your thoughts, and then you're all worried about it, And a lot of times you won't even realize that this has overtaken your life until you've spent hours or even days on this worrying. And we need to be more alert to what we're worrying about and giving it over to God and willing it to Him and saying, God, you are bigger than I am. You can take care of this for me. Please take this worry off of my mind and help me to focus on you. On page 30 through 32, Linda covers some of God's promises to us. One of them being He'll never leave us. Another one being He's going to make us more Christ-like every day. The third one was there's no temptation too great for us, and she referenced 1 Corinthians 10:13, which says, no temptation has overtaken you except such as common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. But with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. God promises that there is no temptation too great for you, and that He will always provide a way for you to be able to endure it. But you need to ask Him to help you with that. The fourth promise is God's constant concern. I've mentioned this before. He wants you to put all of your cares and concerns on Him. Don't put them on yourself. We are frail human beings. We can't withstand the pressure. For the past year and a half, one of the hardest things I've had to deal with is being anxious and having anxious thoughts. It's been a very hard struggle, and one that some days I feel like I am losing, and knowing that God is there for me has been very helpful and encouraging to me in those days where I feel like I am doing nothing but failing as a wife and a mother. So if that's God's 100%, what is man's 100%? Well, on page 33, she covers that. And one of the things we need to do is we need to trust. We need to trust that God is going to be there with us. On page 35, she wrote, we do the possible by faith, trusting God to do the impossible. I thought that was a really good sentence there, maybe even one worthy of writing it down, sticking it on your dresser, and remembering that God can do the impossible. He can move mountains. The second thing we need to do is we need to obey. This obedience is an act of faith and in trusting that God will be there. But that first step is we need to obey what God has commanded us to do. The last thing that Linda reminded us is this is a lifelong process. You're not going to be perfect in this lifetime. You are going to fall. You are going to have struggles. And God is going to be there. He's going to lift you up. This is going to take a lifetime for us to learn. And as much as I would like to think that I'm going to be much improved and a more perfect human being by the time I die, the reality is I'm not going to be that way. In this process of being sanctified and becoming more and more Christ-like, we are going to be bombarded with responsibilities as a wife, as a mother, as a woman, and as a Christian. And quite frankly, that can be overwhelming. So the first thing we need to do is we need to focus our thoughts on Christ. So the first thing we need to do is focus our thoughts on God, keeping our relationship with Him open, trusting in His faithfulness. The biggest thing that has helped me in the past year is keeping up with my private time with God. Even if you only have 5 minutes or maybe 10 minutes, that's 10 minutes that you have to just quiet your soul and to pray to God and ask Him to help you. On page 38, she writes, God will never give up on you, even on those days that you wail. I'll never be a creative counterpart. God wants you to be a creative counterpart. He is there, and He will never leave you or forsake you. That is a wonderful promise for us to take home this week. Next week we will be covering Chapter 4, the Priority Planner. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Also subscribe to this channel for our weekly book study videos. I plan on posting them every Friday morning, and in the description below you will find the link to our Facebook discussion group, and hopefully I will see you next week for chapter 4. Have a great week, everybody.